Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the situation in Darfur and UNAMID operations. I have just returned from a visit to Sudan and Darfur with my colleague, Oscar Taranko and Murad Waba, respectively Assistant Secretary-Generals for the Peacebuilding Support Office and for the Regional Bureau of Arab States in United Nations Development Programme. The objectives of our visit were to, 1, inject momentum in the transition process, 2, convey joint message on the withdrawal of UNAMID and the transition to the Government of Sudan, United Nations interlocutors and key partners, and 3, explore challenges and modalities related to the transition and how these could be addressed early and effectively. Before I share my observations and findings from the visit, I would like to touch upon several updates since the publication of the latest Secretary-General's report dated 14 January 2019. The most significant development is the declaration of a state of emergency by President Bashir on 22 February. It applies to the whole country and is foreseen to be in place for 1 year. In this context, the federal and the state's government were dissolved while maintaining the national and state assemblies and the ministers of foreign affairs, justice and defense. The Minister of Defense was appointed to also assume the functions of the first vice president. In addition, 18 new governors from the military and security apparatus were appointed to replace the dismissed walis. The Sudan Armed Forces are tasked to deliver law and order in addition to national defense. These developments come at a time when the Darfur peace process had come to a standstill once again, in the context of the ongoing demonstrations against the economic and political conditions in Sudan. It should be noted, though, that all along protests in Darfur have remained sporadic and taken place in Niala, South Darfur, on 13 January, and in El Jenina, West Darfur, and El Dayin, East Darfur, on 17 January. Yet, citing solidarity with the protest movements, the Justice and Equality Movement, Jem Jibril, Ibrahim faction, and the Sudan Liberation Army Mini-Minawi faction reversed their December 2018 agreement to resume talks with the Government of Sudan in January 2019. Meanwhile, President Bashir has declared an open-ended cessation of hostilities in Darfur and the two areas on 28 January. Subsequently, on 9 February, the SLA Mini-Minawi, Jem Jibril Ibrahim, and two other groups, the Sudan Liberation Movement Transitional Council and the Sudan's People's Liberation Movement North, led by Malik Agar, extended a unilateral cessation of hostility in Darfur and South Kordofan and Blue Nile states for an additional 3 months. The impact of the recent developments in Khartoum on the dynamics related to the peace process in Darfur is yet to be assessed, but the replacement of all Walis governors will have a bearing on the process, and some rebel groups have demonstrated a stiffening of their position. Mr. President, in Jebel Mara, intermittent clashes between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Sudan Liberation Army Abdul Wahid faction continue. On 17, 28, and 29 January, SLA Abdul Wahid elements attacked SAF personnel in Manabu farming area, 15 kilometers southeast of Golo, and in total, 3 SAF personnel were killed. On 2 February, UNAMID heard sporadic gunfire in the area and sent out a patrol, but it was prevented from proceeding further by the SAF, citing the lack of security clearance. The SAF and SLA Abdul Wahid continued to exchange fire in Manabu on 9, 11, 17, and 19 February, resulting in the death of 7 SLA Abdul Wahid members and 1 SAF personnel in total. In addition, infighting between 2 sub-factions of the SLA Abdul Wahid was reported in Daya village, 12 kilometers northeast of Golo on 17 January, 7 January, and 13 February, with 4 casualties. Reportedly, these factions disagree over their prospect of participation in the peace process, while some of their clashes also seem to indicate competition over scarce resources. Though these clashes have not resulted in new displacement, civilians in the area have been exposed to numerous incidents of robbery, abduction, and violence attributed to both personnel in military attire and SLA Abdul Wahid elements. UNAMID also received reports of repeated sexual violence by the Rapid Support Forces in the Guldo area on 6 February. As mentioned in the progress report before you, the intensification of the conflict in areas of Jebel Mara last year has seen an increase in reported sexual violence incidents. Conflict-related sexual violence remains a threat to the population in Darfur, especially displaced women and girls who face particular risk when they engage in livelihood activities outside IDP camps. And the fear of sexual violence also hampers the return of civilians to their places of origin. I would like to emphasize in that regard that during our visit to Darfur, more specifically to the Sortoni team site, we had an opportunity to exchange with IDPs who all expressed their deep concern over the departure of UNAMID in the absence of trusted and professional law enforcement agencies. I would like to call on the Government of Sudan to continue its effort towards creating conditions propitious to the return of IDPs, and among the confidence-building measures that could be envisaged, to pursue a constructive dialogue with the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on sexual violence in conflict, and swiftly adopt a framework of cooperation as a basis to address sexual violence, including justice and accountability, in line with Security Council Resolution 2429 and consistent with the benchmarks presented in Secretary-General's report of 12 October 2018. There were 3 incidents of movement restrictions around the Golo area by the SAF, claiming the lack of knowledge regarding UNAMID's patrols. Another access denial took place near Menawashe, South Darfur, by the Sudanese military intelligence, citing the lack of security clearance. As a result, the mission could not verify allegations made by the SLA Abdul Wahid on SAF artillery fire, burning villages and causing fatalities on 24th January. In North Darfur, the SAF denied UNAMID's access southeast of Khartoum, claiming that the area close to the Libyan border was rife with rebels and that the safety of peacekeepers could not be guaranteed. The frequency of intercommunal tensions and other security incidents remain relatively low, except for a few hotspots, in particular in the Jebel Mara. In North Darfur, a group of armed men in military attire fired indiscriminately at a group of farmers in Ain Siro, 34 kilometers northwest of Khartoum, killing 1 on 13 January. In West Darfur, the death of an Olad Zaid man triggered clashes between Miseria and Olad Zaid in a village approximately 80 kilometers northeast of El Jenina on 16 and 21st January. 7 Miseria and 1 Olad Zaid were killed, and 560 houses were burnt in 7 villages. In line with Resolution 2429 of the Security Council, we have already completed the closure of 10 team sites by December 2018, which were handed over to the Government of Sudan. The former sector headquarters of Niala, El Dain, and El Jenina are due to be closed by June 2019, leaving the remaining 13 team sites in the Greater Jebel Mara and the logistics hub in El Fasher. The new mission headquarters in Zalinji is now fully operational, while the Office of the Joint Special Representative has relocated to Khartoum. Meanwhile, UNAMID and the UN country team, with the support of their respective headquarters, continue to work together in order to ensure a smooth transition from peacekeeping in Darfur and lay the ground for sustainable peace building. The entire UN system is committed to ensuring, with the Sudanese government, in close coordination with the Sudanese government. In that regard, the Secretary-General issued a planning directive on the transition in Darfur on 7 February, and as I mentioned, during our visit with ASGs Taranko and Waba, we participated in a retreat organized jointly with government representatives, UNAMID and the UN country team to further enhance the coordination during the transition process. Mr. President, from that visit, though, allow me to stress that the United Nations system has made considerable political, humanitarian, and peacekeeping investments since the escalation of the conflict in Darfur 15 years ago. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that the exit of UNAMID does not create a vacuum that leads to persistent local-level tensions or new risk factors. The engagement of the Government of Sudan will ever more be critical in this context. At the same time, our visit has also brought to the fore the challenging factors that both the government, UNAMID, and UN country team are facing to keep the pace of this transition, including in terms of the availability of resources. Indeed, despite all efforts by the mission and UN country team to conclude in less than 2 months the Memorandum of Understanding pertaining to the state liaison functions and the allocation of programmatic resources to the country team for the implementation of key mandated tasks in the areas of human rights, the rule of law, and durable solutions for the internally displaced people, their effective implementation on the ground could end up being complicated by the shortage of liquidities. In addition, efforts should be made in earnest by the international community to mobilize the resources that are needed to support the exit strategy of UNAMID and its immediate effect on the ability of the Government of Sudan and the UN country team to address the challenges of the transition in Darfur while focusing on a difficult economic and social and humanitarian context in the larger Sudan. Moving forward, the recent developments and the ongoing evolution of the conflict dynamics mentioned earlier, namely the lack of tangible progress in the peace process and the localized conflict in Jebel Mara, posit us to think through what can and should be done during the drawdown of UNAMID and beyond. The way forward on the Darfur peace process needs to be discussed jointly between the United Nations and the African Union, including its objectives, expected outcomes, and interlocutors and their constituencies, particularly in the context of evolving national and regional dynamics. The Jebel Mara area is still a conflict zone without the cessation of hostilities. Overall, there are still close to 2 million internally displaced people in Darfur. Local capacity for the rule of law needs to be strengthened for the prevention and resolution of intercommunal tensions, particularly where clashes persist over access to land, migration routes, and other sources of livelihood. Human rights issues, including the protection of women, children, and vulnerable youth from violence, remain significant. Between now and June, we will have an opportunity to assess and recalibrate what UNAMID has achieved and will leave behind. In that context, I would like to acknowledge Security Council's presidential statement of 11 December 2018, which clarified that some of the proposed benchmark and indicators contained in the Secretary-General's report of 12 October 2018 are of more immediate priority and that some reflect longer-term peacebuilding objectives in Darfur. The strategic review ahead of the presentation of the recommendation by the Secretary-General and the chairperson of the African Union Commission for the mandate renewal of UNAMID will offer an opportunity to better unpack those indicators. In the meantime, I can assure you that UNAMID will spare no efforts to give priority to progress against the benchmarks and indicators focused on protection of civilians, particularly relating to internally displaced persons and returning refugees, human rights, rule of law, the humanitarian situation, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, as requested by the Council. I look forward to discussing initial parameters of the review with members of the Council. I thank you, Mr. President.